Good evening, or afternoon, or morning for folks in our Zoom, or what we call Zoom Nation. I'm Mabel Wilson, and I am the director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies, what we call IRAAS, as well as a professor in the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies, AAADS, here at Columbia University. I am speaking this evening on the traditional land and unceded territory of the Munsee Lenape, and I pay respect to their diaspora and honor the past, present, and future rights and presence of the Lenape on their homeland. For the past 29 years, the Institute for Research in African American Studies, founded by the late Professor Manning Marable, has been a fierce advocate of social responsibility in Black studies. The Institute serves as an academic resource center for a local and global community that has cultivated an intellectual tradition grounded in Harlem and in New York City's rich history and culture. Now, in partnership with our Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies, IRAAS and AAADS continues to expand the array of contemporary scholarship and interpretation of the diasporic Black experience, with ongoing series like tonight's Conversations. So again, I want to welcome you all to Conversations, the Viral Underclass, the Human Toll Where Inequality and Disease Collide, by Dr. Stephen Thrasher, who will be in conversation with Dr. Samuel K. Roberts. Tonight's event is co-sponsored with the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. So I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Stephen Thrasher. He holds the inaugural Daniel H. Renberg Chair at Northwestern University's Medill School, the first journalism professorship in the world created to focus on LGBTQ research. He is also a faculty member of Northwestern's Institute of Sexual and Gender Minority Health and Well-Being. A scholar on the criminalization of HIV/AIDS, Dr. Thrasher's work centers on marginalized populations. For instance, in Ferguson, the same week Michael Brown was killed in 2014, Dr. Thrasher has reported on the Black Lives Matter movement for 5 years. His articles are regularly published in the New York Times, BuzzFeed News, Esquire, The Nation, The Atlantic, The Guardian, and The Daily Beast, to name a few. And I think, as we'll learn in our conversation with him tonight about the viral underclass, Dr. Thrasher's research combines journalistic and ethnographic methods to study how racism, homophobia, policing, medicine, incarceration, culture, and health intersects. What I find compelling about the viral underclass, here it is how it intertwines autobiography, first-person accounts, intimate moments, with broad historical forces to unfold how everyday inequalities lived by many are tethered to historical forces of capitalism, racism, homophobia, and violence. I think this makes the viral underclass a must-read for scholars and students, as well as for the broader public. In conversation with Dr. Thrasher is my invaluable colleague, Dr. Samuel K. Roberts, who is an associate professor in history and also an associate professor of Sociomedical Sciences at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. He was also a former director of IRAAS. Dr. Roberts has written, taught, and lectured widely on African American urban history, especially medicine, public health, and science and technology. His widely acclaimed book, Infectious Fear, Politics, Disease, and Health Effects of Segregation, published in 2009 by the University of North Carolina Press, is an exploration of the political economy of race and the modern American public health state between the 19th century and mid-20th century, a period which encompasses the overlapping and mutually informed eras of Jim Crow segregation and modern American public health practice. Dr. Roberts is currently researching and writing a book-length project on the U.S.'s troubled history of race and recovery. He examines the social and political history of heroin addiction treatment from the 1950s to the early 1990s. So he was a perfect choice to bring together with Dr. Thrasher. who Sam and I interviewed a couple of years ago as part of our podcast, Black Lives in the Era of COVID-19, that explored the impact of COVID on Black and Brown communities here in NYC. So we are delighted to have Sam and Stephen back in conversation with our AAADS IRAAS community. So we'll begin with a short introduction of the book by Dr. Thrasher, followed by a conversation with Dr. Roberts. We'll open to the audience for Q&A toward the end of this event, so please remember to post your questions in the Q&A window on Zoom. So I'm going to turn it over to Stephen.
Thank you so much, Professor Wilson, and thank you so much, Professor Roberts. It's a real honor for me to be here in conversation with you, Professor Roberts, and also to be here with IRAAS and AAADS. It feels like a bit of a homecoming for me. Throughout my book tour, I've kind of felt like I'm coming home in different ways. And part of my graduate studies at NYU involved taking a class at Columbia with Saidia Hartman, where I got to study some of these issues. And it was a highlight of my time of my graduate studies. So I feel really honored to be in conversation and to talk about the book that's come out of my graduate studies. So as you were hearing, my book is called The Viral Underclass, and it's about how and why certain kinds of people become infected and exposed to viruses and have disparate impacts with them and die of them needlessly and disparately. And I really started to understand this when I saw the interesting things between two very different viruses, COVID-19 and HIV, which are quite different viruses with different modes of infection, but they were really affecting the same kinds of populations. And I started thinking about how and why that was. It happens in conversation with other viruses. More recently, I've been kind of analyzing this with monkeypox over the summer, but COVID-19 and HIV are the two viruses that inform my study and have probably affected my life the most. And I wanted to, before I get into a reading, just acknowledge a couple of things. One was attending a funeral earlier today of a friend of mine named Angela Ferrante, who herself worked in student services at Columbia for about 20 years. And she was a very, very dear friend of mine. She died of cancer, but I did really notice over the last 3 years of her cancer that getting care through COVID-19 was incredibly challenging, and maintaining intimate contact and friendships and being able to see people was deeply affected by this pandemic. And it really made me think about the ways that our living, our mourning, the ways that we're getting care across a variety of different health conditions has been very much impacted by this pandemic. So I wanted to name Angela. And also, as I'm sure will come up in our conversation, I'm very upset that the president last night said on 60 Minutes that the COVID-19 pandemic is over. And of course, it's not over. We lost about 500 people yesterday. We've been averaging 500 deaths a day for the past couple months, more than a 9/11's worth of deaths every week, and about 14,000 every month. And that's become sort of an acceptable baseline for a lot of liberal politicians. So what I wanted to do in the book, or with my reading here, is read just about a 5-minute segment section from a chapter called Disability as Disposability. And throughout the book, I'm using lots of different data and building on research I've done for many years, but I'm trying for the most part to tell it through the stories of people I've encountered as friends or as sources, and how that's informed my thinking about viruses. And one of the most difficult chapters to write was this one about disability, because it's about the death of one of my editors at the Village Voice, a man named Ward Harkavy. And Ward had this ridiculous death. He had a tooth infection that landed him in the ICU in March of 2020. And then because nobody could go take care of him, he had to go to a nursing home to recover, where the then Cuomo administration was sending people to recover with COVID-19. And that's where he got COVID and died. And about 12,000 people died in nursing homes in that way. And the 3 states that chose to send people with COVID-19 into nursing homes to recover predictably had much higher deaths of COVID-19 in nursing homes. So I just want to read a little bit about the process of actually spreading his ashes at the end of his life. 2 of my other colleagues from the Village Voice and I kind of helped settle his affairs because he didn't have much family, and planned his Zoom memorial service, but then also planned an in-person spreading of his ashes at the end of his life. And I'm just going to read a couple pages about that. On a warm day near the end of the strange summer of 2020, I rented a car in Manhattan and drove to Brooklyn to pick up my friend Camille Dodero. We had become close while serving on our union bargaining committee at the Village Voice about a decade earlier. We'd also bonded over being kicked to the curb by the Voice a year later in a mass layoff. I learned I had been laid off by reading about it publicly on Twitter, not a way that I encourage people to learn they were being laid off. Before meeting Camille and voicers past and present at the Scratcher, a favorite bar to toast our performing a rite of passage with a long history for New York journalists, getting shit canned. Camille and I had fallen out of regular touch in the years since, that is, until we teamed up with our fellow Voice alum, novelist Jen Dahl, to plan Ward's zoo memorial, and a few months after that, the spreading of his ashes. Nine of us gathered on a boardwalk in Long Beach, then crossed over a large sand dune covered in seagrass and moved closer to the Atlantic Ocean our dear friend had loved. Despite the overhead sun, there was a hint of fall in the sea breeze, which felt nice on my masked face. Journalist Cynthia Cox asked us to sit in a circle on the sand, placing a black urn containing Ward's ashes gently on the beach and spacing Ward equidistant among us, as if he were just another one of us sitting there. She read words from people who couldn't come in person, then asked me to read Footnote to Hal by the beat poet Alec Ginsberg. As I read aloud, beginning with Ginsberg's 15 cries of the word holy, and followed by the word is holy, the soul is holy, the skin is holy, the nose is holy, the tongue and cock and hand and asshole holy, I felt in that poem as much as I'd ever felt any poem I had ever read aloud. I felt in my bones that my friend was holy, and his friends were holy, and even viruses were holy, and that forgiveness, mercy, charity, faith are ours, even when we've fallen out with folks, ours even in death. Then, passing out gloves, Cynthia invited us all to take handfuls of Ward and to return him to the sea. When my turn came, Cynthia held the box for me, and I dipped my hand into my friend. I felt scared, nervous, honored, flummoxed, and in awe to be so intimate with one of my former coworkers, a man who'd once nixed most of my story ideas, telling me, "You're a personable guy, just talk to people and listen to them. Everyone likes to be listened to, and stop trying so hard." Ward's remains felt grainy, like ground seashells. I scooped up a handful of my friend's ashes, savoring the texture of what remained of him. The ground remnants of 72 trips around our nearest star. After decades that included moments of laughter, of jokes, of surviving anti-Semitism, of enduring a stuttering stigma, of Trump, of Cuomo, of the humiliation of being laid off near the end of his career, of decades of smoking, of years of life after giving up smoking, of running, of cuddles with his cat Cooter, of a tooth that could kill you, of a final encounter with a virus that could reduce the teeth and bones and blood of someone I hadn't realized I loved so much to mere dust. At that moment, I also remembered how Ward had edited my very first cover story in 2009. Because I was a voice virgin, he'd asked me to sit by his side as he did the final hand proofing to show me how things were done. My story was about the pet death business. After my landlady's cat died and I'd been forced to dispose of the kitty corpse, I had decided to write about how apartment-dwelling New Yorkers couldn't bury their dead pets in backyards, as I had done as a child in suburbia. Ward himself was the son of a vet and an animal lover himself. He edited the piece carefully, balancing the gallows humor and the pathos of my subjects, showing me how to do edits by hand as he put the voice to bed on a Monday evening. I remember him showing me what STEP means, note to retain the original text, as he read through the mock-up of my story through the lower half of his glasses. There was a beat about a virus in my copy, showing a human-turned-pet cremator, bemoaning how slow business had gotten because not enough humans were dying anymore. "Remember the AIDS virus?" says funeral director Ralph Francisco, 66, almost regretfully. "That was supposed to wipe out everybody, but people are living with it for years." Capitalism pushes us to wish for absurd things. When he came to that line, Ward marked it to be a pull quote, a copy that is usually featured in larger print, looked up from the copy, chuckled, and said, "Can't make that shit up, Thrasher." The story had a cover illustration of a pug looking scared, and Ward gave it its subhead, "All dogs go to heaven. Yours is probably getting there in an urn." Remembering this as I removed him from an urn made me laugh amid the tears. Indeed, as Ward blew into our faces, several of us were letting our friend tickle us into body laughter once more, as he'd done so many times in the voice offices or over beers at the Scratcher. Clenching him hard one last time, I tried to throw my friend into the sea, but freed from the weight of the world, he flew mostly upward into a small cloud, which seemed to still itself for a moment before blowing westward and disappearing into thin air. Released from his suffering, Ward was at one with the world. A neglectful government let a virus kill him. But the virus had also paradoxically made him so light that all that was left of him was sunshine and wind and laughter and people by the sea talking about how much they'd loved him. That disabled people are disposable is a lie. But what Ward shared with his friends, what Alice Wong shares with her friends and readers around the world, that's the true shit that you just can't make up. Thank you.
That's a beautiful passage. Among many, Stephen. Good to see you, by the way. It's been a couple of years since I think we last spoke, at least in official capacity such as this. It's good to see you. I want to start off saying I'm sorry for your loss. In that short chapter, you really brought Ward Harkavy, I'm trying not to say to life, but I guess so. Yeah, I really got a sense of who he was, and I am sorry for your loss. And I understand that you were at a funeral earlier today, and my condolences for that as well. And thank you so much for joining us once again in the IRAAS community. There's so many ways to start. This is a fantastic book, by the way. Congratulations. I imagine you're doing the whirlwind tour and all that, hither and yon, and I'm sure some of the questions I have for you might be ones that have been posed to you before, but I've been looking for this conversation. I've been wanting to have it with you for quite a few days now. So viral underclass. Let's just start there. It's a captivating term, right? I mean, it certainly stands out, on the cover. What do you mean by that? Just for our readers who haven't read the book yet, what is the viral underclass?
Sure. A viral underclass is a way that I have come to help myself, and I hope help readers have a analytic about class by learning about what viruses do in our lives. And the term originated from an activist named Sean Struve, who actually saw it yesterday at a reading in his hometown of Milford, Pennsylvania. And Sean originally coined it to deal with a topic I've been writing about for a number of years now, called HIV criminalization, that there are ways that it doesn't only happen with HIV, but it's the one that I've written about the most, that sickness itself can be criminalized. And one ways that states will deal with it is by criminally prosecuting people who either transmit viruses to others or create conditions of exposure, or even for ways that viruses cannot actually be transmitted, but states will prosecute them anyway. And it creates a very different legal infrastructure for people who are living with viruses. And so for people in the community who are familiar with critical race theory, which of course has been heavily developed at Columbia, largely so by my friend and mentor, Kendall Thomas. For people who understand the ways that critical race theory shows how the law itself perpetuates racism, creates differences with race, we can see something similar happening with criminalization laws around disease, that usually the laws actually around race don't explicitly say they apply to Black people. Sometimes they do, but usually we can still see disparate impacts happening regardless of how the laws are written. But with HIV laws, they very explicitly say people who live with HIV are living under a different set of laws. And Sean really even wrote it to understand how infants who are born with HIV because they've become HIV positive during pregnancy are going to live under a separate set of laws for the rest of their life. And he said that creates a viral underclass. I first heard the term when activists were using it to talk about whether or not to abolish HIV laws, which seems difficult to do, or to modernize them and to make them so that at least people who are what's called virally suppressed, if you're HIV positive and taking medication, you literally can't transmit the virus onto other people. And so there was another movement to say, let's at least modernize these laws to say that if you're virally suppressed and can't transmit it, that you shouldn't be prosecuted. But these activists were saying that creates a viral underclass because the people who are likely to be virally suppressed are going to have access to medicine and housing and all these other things, and the people likely not to be virally suppressed are going to more likely to be poor and Black. And I tried to use it, kind of building on both of these uses, as an analytic to both understand the dynamics around why certain classes of people become infected by viruses so much, and even viruses I was saying earlier that are very different. I started seeing maps emerge around COVID-19, and they were the same maps I'd seen around who was likely to get HIV and also AIDS. And also as a way to understand the class dynamics of viruses. And even though I see and I write about in the book, viral underclass can happen all around the world and does happen all around the world, one particularly American way we see it play out is that if you become infected with the virus in the US, you are much more likely to be economically harmed and actually fall down the economic ladder. And we saw that kind of most directly with monkeypox this summer, where people were being mandated to month-long quarantines, but then given no state support to do so. So if you got a monkeypox diagnosis and the state told you had to stay home for a month, you're being put in a really economically precarious position if you work as a bartender or waiter or some kind of work that's face-to-face and then have to lose a month's wages because you've become infected. And that does not have to be, but the United States perpetuates these dynamics repeatedly.
In the context of other infectious diseases, I mean, we could probably put chronic ones in there as well. They're not viral necessarily, quite often. There's that vicious circle, right? You could, if you have a condition, you could be put into poverty, or at least have your economic fortunes greatly diminished. Or if you are already there with greatly diminished economic fortunes, then you are more vulnerable. I think is the argument of your book, right? That you're more vulnerable to viral assaults, right? And these are determinedly social and political, I think, is the reading that you're encouraging us to come away with. I first heard about Michael Johnson some years ago. I was interviewing somebody. I had not heard about him. This is around 2016 or so. And you were also following that case. You and I had not met yet at that time. I think, now that I think about it, when I heard about him and then went and Googled and started reading, so I probably read some of your coverage and just, and then years later, you and I met. Who is Michael Johnson?
Michael is well, I guess he's not so young now. He's 31, but he's a young Black gay man who I met. And I'd probably seen some viral news story about him when he was arrested and given it sort of passing thought, but he was arrested in 2013 and charged with criminally and recklessly exposing or transmitting HIV to 6 other men in St. Charles, Missouri, which is a suburb just west of St. Louis. And initially, he was just described as this HIV spreading monster. That's what some of the headlines described him as. And I was fortunate to have an editor, Mark Schoofs, who had been writing about HIV for decades and thought this didn't sound right and wanted to send me to St. Louis. I didn't know anything about HIV criminalization at the time, but I'd been doing a lot of reporting around race and sexuality for many years. And so I went to meet Michael, and he was very, very different from this depiction of him that I'd seen in quote unquote news stories that were really just sort of regurgitations of prosecutor talking points. And so Michael had been arrested and charged this way for transmitting HIV while he was a wrestler at Lindenwood University in Missouri. And he had gotten to almost the end of his college career without really being able to read or write very well. Everyone really liked his body. He was extremely athletic and he was a very personable guy. But then he got diagnosed with HIV. And once that came out and he was arrested for that, people didn't really want to have much to do with him. And so he ended up being prosecuted and tried and eventually sentenced and convicted to 30 years in prison for HIV transmission. And one of the, for people who aren't familiar with this topic, prosecuting people for HIV doesn't work in any way. It doesn't lower transmission. It was really quite absurd. And one of the reasons why his story ended up in the news was because his screen name and some of his social media accounts was Tiger Mandingo. And so that tapped into sort of generations of American anxiety about race. But I remember when he became, when he was, there were news stories about him as far away as Australia about his diagnosis in his case. And it was really as if he were some kind of global menace to people living with HIV around the world. When there are 40 million people living with HIV, he wasn't sort of this global menace. He was just one person. And when he was prosecuted so strongly, the people in St. Louis and the area had a much harder time getting young Black gay men to get tested, because if you don't know your status, you can't be prosecuted. And the sentence he eventually got was stronger than any sentence except for first-degree murder. It was longer than the average sentence for second-degree murder in the state, and completely out of proportion with any kind of crime or any kind of alleged crime. So he eventually was able to, through my reporting and through a lot of activism, get some help to mount an appeal. And eventually his sentence was overturned. He got out of prison after about 6 years. But he really took an enormous toll for, I think, sort of societal ideas about HIV fear and anxiety, and really took on the role of the scapegoat of everybody's anxieties. And nothing about what happened with him reduced the risk of HIV in this county. In fact, over the years I was reporting on him, while this county was spending God knows how many millions of dollars on this prosecution, they also closed their only sexually transmitted infection clinic in the county, which itself is going to create worse conditions around viruses. So I'm happy to share, Michael is now finally out of prison. He's going to finish his parole soon. He seems to be living kind of a normal life. He seems pretty happy. Unfortunately, he's not allowed to go to school while he's on parole. And as soon as his parole is over, he'll hopefully go to some kind of schooling and figure out what he wants to do with his life, but is living quite well, has his own apartment, and seems to be really happy to be free. But he lost almost his entire 20s to this case.
And I might also mention, I'm going to assume, like so many other millions of people in this country, he's carrying a record, right? So I mean, that punishment will continue on and on.
Well, actually,
right?
he took an Alford plea deal, so he's technically not guilty, which is
I'm
good.
sorry, a what plea deal? I'm sorry,
Alford?
I'm not.
Yeah, it's an
No, I don't know
Alford
that.
plea deal. It's a kind of plea deal you can take where you don't admit guilt, but you are admitting that there's enough evidence to potentially convict you. And so that was sort of worked out after he'd had this, his sentence was overturned, and but the prosecutor could have prosecuted him again. And this was I don't know if you or any of the listeners are familiar with the case of Curtis Flowers that the podcast In the Dark was about, where the same man was prosecuted 6 times for the same crime before the Supreme Court finally intervened, and he was let out after 24 years. So facing the possibility of another trial, he took this Alford plea deal, but the lawyer was very good at getting him one where he's not a registered sex offender. He's technically not guilty, even though he has to finish this probation. So he should have kind of a clean record when he's done, other than, and I sort of put other in air quotes, the mark and experience of having spent 6 years in prison and 10 years under carceral control of some kind by the time he's done with his record, which of course leaves its own mark on a person.
I completely forgot that the case had been overturned, and when you said parole, I assumed that it had not been, because typically you don't get parole if your case is overturned. But I'll have to.
He took the equivalent of a 10-year, like a plea deal, but under these conditions in which he did not have to admit guilt. And he'd already served 6 years, and then the bulk of the rest of it he got to serve under parole and not in prison.
Right, and Johnson is not, by far the only person to have been prosecuted under laws such as this. There's a colleague of yours whom I do not know, but I'm teaching his book this semester, Trevor Hopp, who's written an excellent book about this, about the proliferation of HIV criminalization laws. There's the famous or infamous case of Nushawn Williams,
right,
some years before Michael Johnson. This is certainly part and parcel of this is not a one-off here by any stretch. This is part of our criminal injustice system. Johnson appears a number of times in the book, like he's kind of a touchstone. He's one of the early chapters, but then he's invoked a number of ways to kind of as an illustrative. He walks with us throughout the rest of the book, and you take us to a number of places into a lot of really gripping concepts. I have another question about, speaking of the conceptualization of viral underclass. There are several points in the work where you clearly attach it to, you lay the causal roots at a number of things, but I think it's safe to say one of them is a series over decades of neoliberal and carceral and social welfare eviscerating policies that we could say go back certainly to the 90s. Bill Clinton does not come out looking very good
Yeah.
in, I think is it the 9th chapter or the 10th, somewhere towards I think it's in the third part of the book. And I mean, I think other scholars could trace that back to the the early 70s or so. And then you're very clear that this is also about capitalism and also about our political systems. I think I just mentioned Bill Clinton, but I think you're unsparing in your critique of Republicans and Democrats. So I guess my question is, if we were to kind of pull this out, imagining that you're trying to explain this to the current president, who also shows up in this book, doing some things that are a bit strange, I might say, or at least would raise an eyebrow. If we were explaining this and thinking about like policy changes or structural changes, how much of this is political versus the economic? And I know these are all false distinctions anyway, because it's not called political economy for nothing. But maybe can you just walk us through this? Like, how do we untangle this? It is a phenomenon that you said earlier, you see around the globe, but certainly not in the same iteration. So what is it that makes the American viral underclass so distinctly American?
Thanks. I think so. Yeah, I'll kind of work from the international back into the US. So I have a couple of chapters. The chapter about capitalism, I write primarily about South Korea. And then there's a chapter I write about austerity, because it's very revelatory for me thinking about the work that you do in IRAAS and a lot of work that myself and probably other people watching have done around race in America. A go-to touchstone for me in understanding health is to understand Black racism and sort of white and Black racial dynamics in the United States, and the ways that those historically trace from before the origins of this country through the transatlantic slave trade. And my dissertation work about, which also used the Michael Johnson story a lot, was really kind of understanding the ways that HIV criminalization illuminates and illustrates a certain kind of systemic racism. With the book, I was trying to broaden that out to these 12 different vectors, of which racism is the first. It's the one I deal with first. But the chapter I write in Greece, I sort of show how austerity plays out in a domain completely outside of US Black-white transatlantic slavery history in a relatively poor European country. And we can see similar dynamics happening around how austerity places viruses into bodies. In the United States, I think what makes it particular is, one, the way I said that being sick is likely to make you ill, and that can be a chronic illness. It can also make you ill through viruses, and also being disabled itself, it makes you more likely to be incarcerated. Incarceration is sort of the factor that I think is why the US is such an outlier with these viruses. And we see it across the board. Influenza, the US is 4% of the world's population. We are 20 to 25% of the world's COVID deaths in any given week, and have more than anyone else. And there's been really good research from public health scholars showing that the direct engine behind, particularly around a respiratory virus, is like COVID-19, is the prison, and particularly our jails. The way that people come, no other country in the world, so many people come into jails and go home, and come into jails and go home. And every time that's happening, the virus itself is circulating inside the jail, and it's going back into the communities, and it's coming back in through the communities. And that's perhaps one of the reasons why we've had such an outsized rate of COVID-19 of any country in the world. What I try to pull apart in understanding how that also applies to hepatitis and influenza and HIV and AIDS is that the prison and the jails themselves are sort of a primary engine, but they create these secondary engines. And that I lay, even though there are historical, I'm sure underpinnings before that, and people like Elizabeth Hinton write about this, but that I'm largely placing at Bill Clinton's feet. That when Bill Clinton increased the spending on police and prisons in the 1990s, shepherded through the Senate by Joe Biden, who is literally also calling for 100,000 police, as Bill Clinton did 25 years ago or so. When Bill Clinton did that, he created a lot of the secondary engines that were going to drive this transmission around HIV and AIDS. So if someone's in a jail, jails and prisons are places where you're taking people already structurally more likely to become infected with HIV and putting them in the same place and creating the conditions for that virus to move, and also tuberculosis and hepatitis. But what the crime bill also really did very insidiously, and I cite Michelle Alexander a lot in thinking about this, is that it set up all these traps for people going forward. Once the crime bill passed, if you'd been arrested for a drug charge, you couldn't live in public housing. And so people would come into jail around a charge and not be able to go home to their families. And that greatly exacerbated Black homelessness. And then homelessness itself is this engine for viral transmission. It also becomes extremely difficult, if not impossible, to get a job after you have a prison record. And certainly becomes very, very, very difficult to get a job that has health insurance and health benefits and lets people live lives of dignity and be able to have any kind of sort of prophylactic and proactive preventative health measures. So the ramping up of the criminal incarceration state not only devastated lives kind of at a more immediate level, but it set people up for homelessness and joblessness. And you see all these health disparities increase greatly after there's even drugs for HIV. One statistic I found in my research that has continued to haunt me is that before 1996, when there were no HIV medications, the rate of AIDS amongst white Americans was lower than it was for Black Americans 20 years after there were medications. So like 20 years after there were meds, and we would like to think that the meds are available and HIV and AIDS is going to go down for everyone, the rate was still higher, higher for Black Americans than it ever was before there were drugs for white Americans. And a large reason for that, I think, are the kind of carceral policies that Bill Clinton put into place that created these conditions that really harm people across decades of their lives. And that accounts for a lot of the ongoing racial disparities around HIV and AIDS. And I very much fear we're in that kind of moment right now with COVID-19, that we have these vaccines and we have medication like Paxlovid, and we have all these kind of treatments, but the Congress has already stopped funding treatment for the uninsured, even though that we know that people without insurance are the most likely to become sick and get very sick and die. And they're trying to quote unquote commercialize all of these products and put them back into the market. And if that's the case, if people are going to get COVID shots because they will just get them when they go to their annual physical, we're going to see the same kind of disparities we see around HIV, the way we see around influenza, start to play out with COVID-19 because Black people and poor people just are not going to see a doctor and are not going to be part of the commercial healthcare market.
In terms of, yeah, thank you for that. In terms of the structure of the book, which I really liked, it's almost like a Rashomon, or you're looking at this one thing, the creation of a viral underclass, but from 12 different angles, right? And each chapter gets an angle, and in each one, it's introduced by a vignette or by a figure. There's Zaki O. There's and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on her name.
Lorena Borjas.
Yes, yeah, Lorena Borjas in Queens, and others. The 12, just for our audience to know, just to kind of give them a teaser of what's in the book. These 12 angles are, you said the first one's racism, right? And then there's individualized shame, capitalism, the law, austerity, borders, the liberal carceral state, unequal prophylaxis, ableism, speciesism, the myth of white immunity, and finally collective punishment. These are all really big, themes here. And as I was reading this, and the way you make all these connections, like this, it's almost like the book doesn't go linear. I mean, in chapter 8, you might refer to what we have read in chapter 2, but in a lot of ways, you don't necessarily have to. You could have read the book backwards. Like it's very much like a connected globe that you could just spin around and just kind of look at and zoom in on any one of these concepts. I guess my question is, how long did it take you to kind of think about the structure of this? Because it's clearly something you've thought about before COVID, and I know you've been covering HIV for a number of years now. Is this a book that was long in the making, or is this like the outgrowth of other work? Tell us a little about the process.
Well, I they're like the shortest answer of how long it took the one way it took 8 years, the other way it took 2 years. It really began with writing about the story about Michael Johnson and HIV criminalization, and the first aha moment for me in that process was reporting about Michael Johnson in the beginning of 2014 in St. Louis. It was really in St. Charles County, but also in St. Louis County, and then being sent back there that fall to cover the murder of Michael Brown, and asking the HIV activists and public health people I'd worked with what I should look for in Ferguson, which is in what's called St. Louis North County. And they said they'd been in the Canfield Green apartment complex where Michael Brown had been killed because there had been new cases of HIV, and Ferguson has this higher rate of HIV and AIDS. And so I started to see these parallels and overlapping maps between concentrations of Black poverty, police violence, and HIV and AIDS. And I keep coming back to that and seeing how often it intersects with all these other engines of poverty and also isms in the society, particularly incarceration. And I had wrote that as part of my dissertation, and so I worked on that for many years. And then when I finished and started at Northwestern, I did not know until I really arrived at Northwestern if I could write my tenure book for a trade press or I had to write for an academic press. And I found out once I arrived that because my home tenure line is in a journalism school, I could actually write a book for a trade press. So I was sort of thinking about how do I kind of create, or how do I share sort of the scholarly and the theoretical work that I'm doing in some kind of trade way. And that's when COVID-19 hit. And I was literally working on my proposal in February, March of 2020. And then I didn't know, as many of us, what was going to happen. Are we going to lose our jobs? I just started as a professor. Was I going to lose my professor job? Are people going to keep buying books? But my agent asked to look at my dissertation, and she's the one that saw how I ended with a chapter on the viral underclass, sort of as an opening way to think about what would happen after this issue of HIV criminalization. And it was her idea, her name is Tanya McKinnon, to use that. And she said, think about how to create this book as an analytic for writing about whatever is going to happen going forward with this new pandemic. And she predicted that there would be flash in the pan COVID books, and there would be sort of reported COVID books, but she challenged me to use what I've been doing to sort of think of a theoretical way I could build on the HIV criminalization and the work I've been doing around HIV to write about this next pandemic and give us ways to understand and think about this pandemic and pandemics going forward. So that process actually happened quite quickly. Just over the course of a couple of weeks, I wrote a new proposal and ended up with my wonderful publisher and editors at Celadon. And together, it was originally, I think, 8, but then I ended up understanding these 12 vectors, kind of thinking about what are the vectors? Why does what dynamics are happening when you take a virus like HIV, which is an incredibly inefficient retrovirus? You have to have many, many exposures before transmission is likely to happen. And then retroviruses enter your body and typically take a long time to work and never leave your body. And then this respiratory virus, comparatively, COVID is extremely fast. It can enter your body and pass through it in a couple of weeks or kill you in a couple of weeks. But then once it's gone, the virus is no longer in your body, even though it may leave lingering harm. And so I used it to think what beyond the mechanics of how it physically moves, what are the vectors that are doing this? And they're connected to biology and physical structure, but they really are driven by these social engines. And so that's how I kind of tried to think about it. And then I felt under the gun because we were in a public health emergency, and I wanted to share what I was writing as quickly as I could do so responsibly. The journalist in me had a hard time working on something for so long because I usually work on projects for a number of weeks, occasionally a number of months, and sometimes just a few hours. But it took about a year to draft the book from the time that I sold it, and then it took us about 8-10 months to edit it. So the actual writing of the book took about 2 years, but the thinking and the reporting I've been doing for about 8 years.
Right. And to be clear for our audience too, the term viral underclass comes from, you said Sean Straub was his last name?
Yes,
Straub, yes.
Yeah.
In the context of HIV, but in your formulation, it's not really literal, right? I mean, you mentioned, other diseases that are, bacterial, for example, and I think at one point you mentioned addiction as being viral, which I mean, obviously that was a metaphor, not literal at all. Um, it's really about bodily illness, right, and vulnerability. So I guess I have a couple of questions. In reading, I got about halfway through, and I started thinking about in terms of the level of risk. We're also talking about dispersion of risk, right? This is something that happens under capital. Some people are made to born, or racialized capital, or racial capitalism. Some people are made to bear risks that are higher and ultimately more detrimental because they have less resources to, face a risk than others. And it occurred to me, this is often what we see also in global climate change, right? Like when you look at some of the countries or the areas that are being most affected by climate change, these are places and people who, quite often could least afford to face these risks as well. So I guess maybe that's more a statement than a question. Did that ever, as you were writing this book, did that occur to you? I mean, there's so many thoughts in here that are generative. I don't expect that all of them, kind of, maybe some of them hit the cutting room floor as you were editing.
Yeah, I
But
mean, I
clearly
think,
it's more than viruses, right?
yeah, I mean, I am very interested in viruses, and one of the things I take up in chapter 2 as a journalist and someone who studies media is like, why do we think of viruses? Why do we think of viruses as metaphors? In metaphors, particularly, why do we think of viral media? We don't talk about bacterial media. And so even though I do a couple times write about bacteria, I'm primarily writing about viruses. And I think that there are some reasons why. One is viruses have historically been associated with vice. They also, and this is a very much a public health term that I mentioned this in the book too. I don't use this kind of conversationally or in journalism, but viruses need, quote unquote hosts. They need something to live in to be able to move on. And so bacteria can spread on a surface, it can actually reproduce, but viruses have this very intimate connection with living beings because they need living beings to be able to move onward and reproduce. So I think that there's sometimes kind of fun and interesting ways to think about why is this term and why is this organism the one that we think of in this way. They're also incredibly prolific, and this happened after the book was done being edited, but the new NASA telescope is produced these incredibly beautiful images of such a tiny percent of the universe, and there are more viruses on Earth than there are stars in the universe. And so that sort of overwhelms me to think about what a role they are. And when you have COVID, you have like 10 individual viruses for every cell in your body. So I don't think of them as sort of this external thing at all. They're very much a part of who we are. But it is also a metaphor, and I try to think about how that metaphor, when it's problematic, when it's helpful. And I do think, I think there was in some draft more about climate change, but I think that it does really speak to the ways that we have to be interdependent with one another. What's happened with COVID-19, I think, offers us a lot of lessons and a lot of pitfalls for what could happen with climate change and how deeply interconnected we are, particularly with viruses. A study came out in Nature 4 or 6 weeks ago about the quite known problem for some time that as more living beings descend on a smaller percent of the globe, we're going to be jockeying against each other more often, and there's more opportunity for what are called zoonotic jumps when viruses move from non-human animals to humans. And particularly the study was looking at kind of the migratory pattern in the homes of bats and how dangerous it's getting, that bats are losing so much space on the globe where they used to roam quite freely out of human interaction. They're coming in more and more interaction with humans. Coronavirus probably came from a bat. And so that will dovetail with the planet cooking up in dangerous ways. But I think that the viruses really show us that we have to work interdependently because our fates are very intertwined with one another. And so I do think about that a lot. And as you said, risk is a big theme in this book. And the president saying that the COVID pandemic was over speaks to one of the risk dynamics I understood in reading this book, and that there are things that the risk should be shared of what's happening with something as socially connected as a virus. And the president's doing sort of a classic neoliberal move, taking risks that should be spread across the society and really heaping it on individuals and saying the state should not have a role in paying for these medications anymore, not even the vaccines. You should be able to get it through your own private insurance. If you don't have insurance, too bad, so sad for you, and that the risk should just be borne by individual people. But it simply does not work from a public health standpoint to think of 330 million people all individually negotiating risk, deciding whether or not to wear masks, whether or not they can afford to get vaccinated. This is something that the state can do and could spread the risk out. And the state is very much trying to move away from collective risk and make it a matter of quote unquote individual responsibility.
That's certainly the message of your epilogue, where you're inviting us to really critique how we think about our own bodies, right? We've rested. And one of the many things I like about this book is that you are really, as much as you have critique for the conservative right, you're really taking kind of the center and liberal political spectrum to task for its failures, shall we say, visionary failures. And so in the epilogue, you're challenging us to really critique how we think about bodily autonomy. Is it really sustainable, you ask? At least maybe I'm reading this. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
No.
You're asking us, is it really sustainable for all of us to say, hey, I've got my bodily autonomy, and you use in the epilogue the co-optation of my body, my choice that anti-maskers did. And that's I think probably everyone in our audience knows this is a phrase that's taken for pro-reproductive rights, the pro-reproductive rights movement. But in 2020 and afterwards, we saw anti-maskers saying my body, my choice, and you're inviting us to actually critique that as a political theory, right? Like, is it really sustainable for all of us to walk around saying it's my body, I do what I want with it, and I'm not in the context of reproductive rights or reproductive justice, but certainly in a meta philosophical way. If all of us, you said 330 million in this country, but also 7 to 8 billion on the planet, like, what is your vision of a new bodily formulation? What
Well, I'm still working on the formulation, but I think I tried to think through some of that in this book. And when I was in graduate school, one of the most challenging ideas I first encountered was rethinking my body, my choice, and particularly trying to understand the bodily politics and political economy around perceiving individual bodies and ownership. And of course, ownership can be transferred in enslavement. So there are difficult things about that. I do think that people who are pregnant or people who want to get various kinds of healthcare or to transition and gender expression, of course, I think everyone should have choices in being able to do that. But I think that there are real limits in primary only or even primarily thinking about that as a matter of choice. And for me, in the lesson of viruses, they dispel the idea that there is any autonomy. I mean, we're all going, like, the human race is not going to continue to reproduce and survive if there's not interconnectivity that happens through sexual reproduction. And of course, through breathing, through socializing, through all kinds of ways, we continuously are negotiating our existence. And viruses go between us, they change our DNA, they change our code, when we share them, and we simply are not autonomous. So for me, the growing edge is to think about, rather than just autonomy, what does it mean to be in a negotiation of mutual benefit, and understanding how can we, in an interdependent way, learn to negotiate life together in ways that make life more beautiful and more livable. A lot of that thinking came from the writing I'm doing about people who are disabled, because disabled people are not independent, and they're often made to feel bad because they are interdependent with others. And there's nothing wrong with being interdependent with others. Like, we all need each other to live on this planet. And around the language of choice itself, though, because the book was done and was starting to be printed when the Dobbs decision came out, which both undid Roe and very dangerously also might undo a number of LGBTQ protections. It really made me think too about what work is language doing when we try to talk around what it is that's actually happening. And so I think one of the reasons that Democrats talked about abortion as choice was not merely to frame it as a kind of neoliberal freedom, but it was out of fear to talk about abortion itself as a necessary form of healthcare and an ethical form of healthcare. And I've thought about that a lot this summer as I've been working about monkeypox and talking about the overwhelming evidence from around the globe that it was primarily moving through sexual transmission, almost overwhelmingly between men who have sex with men. And part of that was takes a certain amount of humility when you're studying viruses, because for 7 decades, monkeypox viruses were doing one thing, and then something happened in the past couple of years and it was doing something else. And we always have to have a sense of humility with viruses because they mutate and they suddenly are doing something that we're not predicting. But I really rejected the idea that there was anything shameful in talking about that. Yeah, we're seeing not only is it moving primarily through networks of men who have sex with men, but there seems to be some kind of dynamic through which it's likely moving through receptive anal intercourse. And I don't want to be ashamed in talking about that. I don't think everyone should feel bad about that. And we need to understand it, because maybe using condoms will help in a way that hasn't been necessary. Condoms haven't been as necessary with drugs like PrEP and things that have dealt with HIV. And also, I don't want people to have stigma around sitting next to gay people, or there are these terrible viral videos, to use that term, of showing suspected cases of monkeypox in the subway, and a kind of unnecessary worry was coming around that. And so I've been thinking about, if we named abortion as a form of necessary healthcare that people should be able to access, and if we said people who have anal sex should be able to do so safely, and so we want to understand the dynamics in which they can do so, that's a very different politics for me than just sort of framing it as choice and something that's not discussed in a technical way, in a way that gives people the information they need, and that is not giving into a sense of shame that what is being spoken about is so shameful we can't name it.
Thank you. I just looked at our clock, and I have been instructed, or at least prior to our conversation, I was instructed at the 7 o'clock hour to cease monopolizing your time and let some of the members of our audience also put in their questions, which I believe they can do on the Q&A button on your Zoom console. There is one from Dr. Antoine Johnson. By the nature of the question, I think I know who this Antoine Johnson is down at Johns Hopkins University, brilliant scholar of HIV history. And Dr. Johnson asks you, what similarities does Dr. Thrasher see among the underclass, and he puts that in quotes, from HIV/AIDS in historical context and COVID-19? I'm curious about the ways folks at the grassroots level have told and showed policymakers, health professionals, and other ways racism exacerbates poor health outcomes, and suggested alternative modes of harm reduction only to be ignored.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. So historically, HIV is a virus that, as I was saying earlier, is relatively inefficient. It takes a lot of opportunities for it to do what it needs to do, and yet it's quite widespread. There are estimated 35 to 40 million people living around the world, and living with HIV. In the United States, about 1 million. And HIV medication has been quite good and very helpful since the mid-1990s. But who gets it and why do they get it is a huge challenge. And some of those things are very similar to the challenges with COVID-19 medication involving trademark and distribution. HIV meds did not get outside of the United States to most of Africa and a lot of Asia for about 7 years after they invented. And of course, how many millions of people died during that time. Domestically within the United States, which the CDC first announced in 2016 that 1 in 2 Black gay men are projected to become HIV positive in their lifetime. My colleague and mentor—
This is just not to make you repeat yourself, but just for clarity for everyone. So you said 1 in 2.
1 in 2.
Yes.
And this was in 2016. So I feel like COVID probably has put aside some resources that could have looked into this more to see if PrEP or other things were intervening. But the projection in 2016 was that if conditions didn't change, 1 in every 2 Black gay men or Black men who have sex with men in the United States would become HIV positive. And the rate of HIV among Black gay men in the United States was such that if we were a country, we would have the highest rate of HIV on the earth. And so there's this dynamic that even though HIV is much more prevalent, and there have been, and particularly AIDS is a lot more prevalent in some countries in the global South, within the sort of viral underclass of the United States, it's kind of concentrated in an even worse way. And a lot of this has to do with the sorts of vectors that I'm writing about in my book. HIV is so slow acting, it shouldn't, people should not get AIDS. They should be able to get on medication and go about their lives quite normally. But because they don't see a doctor for 5 years or 7 years, or 10 years or 15 years, they might not know until they have an AIDS diagnosis. And if they're incarcerated, they're going to often have worse health outcomes. So a lot of those same things are playing out with COVID-19 as well. If you are somebody who has health insurance and has particularly if you have a job that allows you to work from home, you're going to have sort of built in all these prophylaxis, or various forms of prophylaxis. Some of them are physical, and some of them are more conceptual. And so I see like similarities between HIV and COVID in these ways, that if you are someone who is homeless or living without a home, you're more likely to become infected by both of these viruses. If you don't have health insurance, you're more likely to become infected by these. If you're incarcerated, the same thing. And so like these same social vectors are playing out. And it's a bit strange to understand why tuberculosis or COVID would, of course, get breathed in a jail, but HIV also moves in a jail, because you're concentrating people and doing these sort of primary engines and secondary engines. One of the things I found that was so interesting was that COVID-19 was disparately impactful upon all LGBTQ people. And the reason for that actually didn't have anything to do with sexual practices or practices around gender identity. It had to do with the ways that LGBTQ people are already made economically, professionally, and socially vulnerable in so many ways in the society. LGBTQ people are much more highly represented in retail work, which is one of the reasons, and retail workers are those who are getting the brunt of COVID-19 from the beginning of the pandemic till now. So you can see why if LGBTQ people are less likely to have jobs with insurance and more likely to be working retail and more likely to be homeless and more likely to be incarcerated, then that's the reason why. And that's where I try to use this framework to say of the viral underclass that we don't always just follow kind of sexual practices, but there's certain things that are happening economically. And that, I think, really shows the connection between HIV and AIDS vulnerability and COVID-19 vulnerability, that a similar kind of underclass is being made. And the last thing I'll say about this is we're seeing this legislatively in very bad ways right now that map onto the past. So when Florida has its Don't Say Gay bill, and when these various states, Texas, Tennessee, Alabama, all these states are trying to have these anti-trans laws, they're creating the pathways to open up for various kinds of viruses. So if you were a queer person in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, or 2020s, growing up in a state where there's no LGBTQ specific sexual education, then you're more likely to become infected with viruses. And if you're in a state where you maybe even had the ability to get the hormones you need as a trans person, to get the healthcare you need as a trans person, and that's taken away, people are going to find that somehow it's most likely going to come from the contraband market. That's going to open up more likelihood for hepatitis or HIV. And then also, people are just not going to have the information they need and not be able to protect themselves. And so that's another way I see kind of the same sort of manufactured vulnerabilities happening across these two pandemics with these very different viruses.
I'm reminding audience, if you want to put your question in the Q&A button, please just toggle that and you can write that in there, and I'll present it to Dr. Stephen Thrasher, our guest this evening in IRAAS Conversations. As I was reading the book, Stephen, I thought about Harriet Washington's work, and she has two books that deal with behavioral health, one in behavioral health and one in, shall we say, intellectual health or mental health. And the first one, oh my goodness, I think it's called Infectious Madness. I know madness is in the title. This was some years ago. And then more recently, I think her second to last book is A Terrible Thing to Waste.
Yes.
The first one is making or pointing out that there are a number of behavioral health problems that might be viral in origin, and and she's elucidating some of the pathways by which people become vulnerable to that, even though they're not necessarily visible in a clinical setting. They're very subtle. And then the second, more recent book, A Terrible Thing to Waste, is about how people of color are vulnerable quite often to environmental assaults, toxic environments in particular, that are detrimental to cognitive health, to cognitive function. And so it occurred to me, given that in your book, viral is not always literal, that perhaps we could even have a 13th and 14th and 15th chapter, because I think what might fit in the rubric would be, behavioral health. And when you were just saying about, LGBTQ plus, IA plus populations being vulnerable by legislation and not, and for reasons that have nothing to do with, as you said, sexual practices, it also occurred to me, yeah, that's a very stressful life. If you live in that environment where it's like in a state with, don't say gay, that you are living in a state where you are, being made invisible or unutterable by law. To say, that's just one example as well. So I guess I'm asking, was there a point where you thought about behavioral health? And you also mentioned, I think there was a line where you said addiction is also viral, and again, clearly metaphorical. But was there a point, or maybe a point in your future, where you're thinking about psychiatric epidemiology? Because there are many behavioral health conditions that not literally viral, but certainly will transmit themselves across populations. That's why in the school, if someone commits suicide in a high school, good practice is to get as many counselors there as possible, because it's quite often the case that others will have the same idea, and you will see an epidemic spike at that school or even in that school district. So there is again, not literally viral, but there are ways in which psychiatric epidemiology, I think, might fit into this. Is that your next book? I know you're still catching your breath from this one and still on the book tour, but what's on the horizon?
The next book is something very different, I think. Although I'm gonna continue to write about viruses and public health in other ways. I find that, and I don't remember where I first heard this concept, but I do feel very strongly that viruses demand a sense of humility, because they change, they adapt. They're very wily, they're very adaptive, and there's so many of them that they can do things. Some of them can do things quite quickly and change the dynamics quite quickly. And so we are learning things about Epstein-Barr and multiple sclerosis, and various sorts of diseases that have perhaps viral origins, or that make people much more likely to become infected. So I think that's one reason why we want to really try to stop the transmission of SARS-CoV-2 as much as possible, because we don't know what it's going to do long term. We've only been aware of this virus for 3 years, and there could be great consequences 5, 10, 15, 20 years out. And I don't say that sort of as a conspiracy theorist, but just like having a sense of humility about what can we observe over what period of time to get a sense of what these viruses are doing. In terms of thinking about viruses metaphorically, and I've had some pushback, which it's fine. I welcome criticism around thinking about addiction as being viral, which I've heard. And I had a reader, kind of an expert on addiction, who had actually suggested entering that and adding that. And the dimension of it that I think is important to understand is that there are ways to sort of map how addiction moves that are somewhat predictable. We know that looking at places with enormous economic decline that happens rapidly, that it's quite likely that certain kinds of drug use are going to increase when people don't get the mental health care they need, and also the social support they need from the social support of their jobs and receiving health care. And that in those conditions, it's quite likely that the hepatitis and HIV and things like that, if they enter into those environments, they will move very quickly. But addiction itself has these dynamics that move through families, and if you have a parent or grandparent that are suffering from addiction, it's much more likely to come up in other places in the family. It can happen in social networks in that way too. And so I think that we should be understanding and compassion and thinking about these non-judgmentally is sort of pathways that are somewhat predictable and can be treated, and to understand that if certain economic conditions and lack of social support enter into the equation, that it's likely that these things could move. And with suicide as well, suicide is often described as happening in clusters. And so I think that viruses help us understand that the physical conditions of our lives and also the wellness and sickness of our lives is connected to the people around us and is connected to the wellness around us. And I think they also show us that we don't have to think of ourselves as all one individual body. We're connected to the other bodies, and we have a responsibility to the social body around us to take care of it, and not only try to take care of just ourselves by ourselves, but to the people that are around us and part of the body that form our community.
There's another question in the chat here from Julia Tellerman, who asks, I had initially seen some discourse surrounding monkeypox that urged individuals and medical professionals to avoid calling monkeypox an STI among MSM. And she puts those 3 words in quotes, to stave off stigma similar to HIV and allow people who are not MSM to understand that they could also be infected. How do you suggest striking a balance between keeping this virus and parenthetically, or any future virus, abortion, etc., in parentheses, from becoming stigmatized and relegated to the underclass, while still talking about the reality of the viral spread, as you previously mentioned? I'm sorry, I frowned up there because I wasn't quite sure of the connection, but I think I understand now how why they put abortion in the parentheses along with future viruses. Basically, I think the question goes towards stigma.
Yeah. So thank you for that question. I've thought about this a lot, and I wrote a long piece. I'll try to find it, drop it in the chat. But I grew to understand pretty quickly that monkeypox, as it has evolved in this version of it, is acting as an STI. And for me, it was not, when I was seeing like rates of 95 to 98% happening in men, I've never seen anything like that with any other virus that I've studied. And when I sort of looked at the definitions of STIs, which includes, of course, HIV and chlamydia and syphilis and all these things, they can move in multiple ways. You know, HIV and AIDS, I initially got to know primarily through sexual transmission, but I do research in multiple jurisdictions, including Puerto Rico and Greece, where a major, if not a majority of the cases are actually moving through injection drug use. But it never occurred to me that you couldn't study something like HIV or hepatitis in moving through injection drug use and also not understand it as an STI, because it's moving sexually and people need to understand sexually how it's moving. And so with monkeypox, it seemed very strange to me that it was happening only in this one community and that there couldn't not be a strong sexual component to how it's moving. And the danger I saw, like there was, I think, some well-intentioned but misguided fear of stigma that could come around naming it as an STI and thinking that, you know, that children are being harmed if they're also getting it. But this also seemed weird to me because HIV, again, and herpes and things like this are also STIs, but herpes can pass through pregnancy. Herpes can pass through the moment of birth. Herpes can move through kissing, which is not necessarily sexual. And HIV as well can move these ways. And as I've looked into, there are very few pediatric cases of monkeypox. There are a number in Africa, and a disproportionate number of Africa, which actually points to the possibility that those cases are the previous strain and not even sort of this strain that seems to be moving more sexually, but also the cases were like under 4 years old or even under 6 months old, which doesn't necessarily involve casual close contact, but extremely close contact of holding an infant, and possibly also breast milk or you know, sharing food and utensils with. And then also the cases were like were teenagers, and teenagers are also sexually active, so that doesn't necessarily mean nothing that's unpredictable. We deal with HIV as a matter of sexual health for teenagers. So my way of dealing with it was just trying to have no sense of embarrassment or shame and just say, like, this is how we understand that it's happening. And for a very small percent of people in the world. It was about 1.5% of the cases were women. We want people who think they have it to also come forward, but there could be a stigma. I found the stigma in saying, like, it's so disgusting that we won't talk about what it is. And I also feared, when we had so little vaccine in the United States and globally, we really need to make sure it got to the people who needed it. So I did not want straight people who sort of think I could get it in a movie theater to sort of be making a run for this vaccine, when that wasn't the way that it actually was moving. And the way that my colleagues and I have dealt with this, I think relatively responsibly in the WHO, even, I thought, did a really good messaging around it, was just to say, like, this is the population that we see where it's happening. This is where it needs to be addressed. And I think it speaks to something that's not a quick, there are two things that aren't a quick fix. One, we live in a homophobic world. That's not going to be done or changed by this. The homophobia is there. That's a long-term project to fix. The other thing that I think this dynamic showed was how often in the United States we don't talk about sexual identity in relation to an action. Like, LGBTQ identity has sort of been fused in a kind of amorphous way as an identity, and is like clothing you wear, things you watch. But talking about actual sexual practices is become kind of taboo, as if it's something to be ashamed about. And one reason, I'll just end with this illustration, I think it's really important to focus on acts, is that it's quite possible. I have a colleague who's researching this. It's possible that the cases of women who are becoming infected could involve anal sex. And if that's the case, we need to understand that, not be embarrassed about that, and to be able to say, like, okay, this isn't about identity. This is about certain actions that people across a range of genders can experience. And we see how they're happening around men who have sex with men in this way. But if we don't ask those questions in the first place, we don't know. Like, when HIV first was understood, we didn't know how it moved. And there are STI, like Ebola can move through sperm and semen as well. So that needs to be a part of that virus, even though, like, people don't commonly think of it as an STI. And if we don't actually study those things, we can't protect people. So that's how I think. And I actually think across the course of the summer, activists and journalists and healthcare professionals did a relatively good job with this virus, and helping us start to bring the cases down and help educate the public about it. It's a tricky thing to do, but the work just has to be done. We can't flinch about it.
There's earlier on in the book, when you're, I was going to say fleshing out, but yeah, we'll go ahead with that metaphor. When you're fleshing out the theory,
I don't mind.
Fleshing out the theory of the viral underclass, you write, this is in quotes, "A theory of the viral underclass provides a map for a kind of worldwide liberation in a similar way to how the Combahee River Collective believed that," and this is a quote inside the quote, "if Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression." That's the end of the inside quote. You continue to say, "I believe that creating a world where the conditions that create the viral underclass are abolished would improve life on Earth for nearly everyone." What are the possibilities for political mobilization here? Because I think that's in the introduction where you write that. And then the next 12 chapters are fairly bleak in a lot of ways. There are inspiring people there, do not get me wrong. But the situations in which they are living and working are bleak. Zachy O is lynched. He's murdered by police and a shop owner in Athens, right? Borges, oh my God, Lorena Borges, dies of COVID, right? And she's doing harm reduction and street outreach for years and years, and we lose her on the eve of Trans Visibility Day in late March. There's your good friend and colleague Ward Harkavy, that kind of tragically ironic, he essentially dies of a toothache, but not of the toothache, he dies of coronavirus because he didn't get good aftercare. So what are those liberatory possibilities to which you refer in the introduction, and for which we end up thirsting by the time we get to your epilogue.
Um, so to start with the the Combahee River Collective, from their question, excuse me, years ago, I remember asking myself, what would a world without AIDS look like? How could I imagine that? What and that would mean, a world without AIDS would not only mean that everyone got HIV medication, which is something that actually seems not that difficult to pull off, or compared to some other revolutionary things that have to happen. But it would also mean a world where people are not harmed by incarceration, where everyone has home and shelter, where everyone sees a doctor whenever they need to and can afford to, and where people are not made to feel ashamed of their bodies or their sexuality. And it's a world that I like to think about trying to imagine into existence using an abolitionist framework. And I feel similar with COVID-19 or viral underclass when I say, what would that world look like where there wasn't COVID? It is possible. I mean, Cuba doesn't really have COVID. They have, a death a week sometimes now, or sometimes weeks without them. They're an extremely poor country compared to the United States, and yet they've had a much different relationship with this virus than the United States does. And I think that we could imagine such a world, but it means understanding that viruses do not only come into being at the moment of transition. There are all these steps before them and all these stages after them. And you're right, there's a lot of bleak stories in this. There's a line in the Boston Globe review of the book that says, it's not a spoiler to say most of these stories end badly. And for me, part of it is both dealing with all manner of mourning of people I've known or people I've known secondarily or people I've known personally, but I try to think about what is it that they are what are the viruses teaching and what are these people teaching. And I had an extremely sweet moment. A week ago, I was in my hometown in Ventura County, California, and I spoke at the Barnes & Noble, where I was a bookseller in the 1990s. And it was
speaking of coming home of talks, yeah.
And I met with a young bookseller there who was really lovely and told me that after they read about Lorena, they had started carrying around with them condoms, tampons. They're doing training for Narcan to try to carry on Lorena's spirit with them. And that really touched me. And I feel like, Lorena, Zaki, these people showed us lots of things that we could do. And the liberatory potential, I think, particularly with this virus, that's even more so than HIV, is that it's just it's literally touched and infected so many people. And it's brought a worldwide consciousness around thinking about these things on a scale that hasn't happened before. I mean, I don't actually write that much about this in the book, but I've been thinking about it since. I have a kind of almost survivor guilt around understanding that I'm the beneficiary of what ACT UP activists did, and that all this beauty has come into my life, and these people I love dearly have come into my life around this virus that's killed so many people. There's this beautiful kind of queer culture and culture of mutual interdependence that's come out of AIDS activism that affected a relatively small portion of the globe. Coronavirus has affected everyone in the globe, and we've never had an experience before in human history where everyone's sort of been touched by something similar and being able to communicate about it at the same time. So I think that there's the possibility for a lot of liberation. And we do see signs of that. This massive unionization effort that's been happening from Starbucks to Amazon to the railroad workers, so much of that is because people became aware of their precarity under this pandemic. And I don't feel bleak in kind of thinking about the long-term history and consequences that come from social action when I see things unfolding over time. For example, Biden finally passed a student debt relief plan, and that comes out of 11 years of organizing that started with Occupy Wall Street. So even though I feel sad and depressed and angry and frustrated at moments where we feel like things are rolling back, I do think that a lot of seeds have been planted in these 2-3 years, and we have no idea how young people, old people are going to take these lessons throughout their lives. But I think that there's a lot of liberatory potential in what we've all gone through, and particularly so in understanding and honoring the memories of people we've lost along these past couple of years.
Well, Dr. Stephen Thrasher, as that future arrives, we will look to you for more of your work and reporting coverage and your scholarship about it. In the meantime, there's so much in this book that we did not get to, but Professor Wilson has come on the screen to let us know that our time is up. So thank you to the audience. Again, Dr. Thrasher's book is The Viral Underclass, The Human Toll When Inequality and Disease Collide, on Celadon Press. And I believe that Sharon put a link to Celadon's website so you could purchase your e-copy, your paper copy, or your audio book there. Thank you so much, Stephen. It's great to see you, and congratulations on this fantastic book.
Thank you so much. I deeply appreciate it.
Mabel?
Yeah. No, excellent. Really fantastic conversation. And it's true, there's so much more to talk about. And thank you, Sam, for that last question about, thinking about what's beyond this, right? And the election season's coming up. It's clear with Biden declaring the pandemic over, the Democratic Party isn't offering us much hope overall in terms of kind of recognizing the systemic nature of a lot of the challenges that Black and Brown communities are facing, and the degree to which, the stressors of everyday life, is leading to, premature death and high morbidity. So, I think that the book clearly, what I think is really remarkable, it really shows all the connections between that without being overly jargony or academic. And that's why I think it's a really great read for so many people. And I think the other thing that I appreciate is that you also point to the Combahee Collective, and the ways in which Black women, lesbians, we're doing a kind of thinking intersectionally, thinking and critiquing racial capitalism, thinking about alternative ways in which communities can form, be in conversation, and also maybe change the kind of on-the-ground conditions that are so critical in producing so much of, these crises. And and I appreciate the connection and the recognition that those are possibilities outside of neoliberalism and liberal democracy.
Thank you so much for those extremely kind words.
I think that's Mabel's way of saying we're going to have to bring you back to talk more about your future, your ongoing work.
Yeah.
And if that's not what she's saying, that's what I'm saying.
And definitely would love to hear about the new projects. But I think it's a really remarkable book. And so it was a pleasure reading and pleasure having you. And so I just want to say a heartfelt thank you to Stephen, not only for your myth-busting scholarship, but also path-breaking activism to enlighten us about these inequities. And also to Sam for bringing, your deep knowledge to histories and around public health and racial inequalities. So I think this has really been a great conversation. And I just want to say, of course, a special thanks to our dedicated colleagues, Sean Mendoza and Ms. Sharon Harris, who were really responsible for pulling this together. And also our IRAAS assistants, Olivia Pearson and James Jennings, who were essential in shaping tonight's event. And I just want to share a little bit of what's upcoming. We're pleased to be a supporter of Flowing Breakthroughs in Feminist Jazz and Literary Studies, a conference in celebration of Farah Jasmine Griffin, our founding chair of AAADS. And this event is hosted and organized by Yale University's Black Sound and the Archive later this week on Friday, September 24th and Saturday, September 25th. Not to be missed, so check out Yale's website for further information. And also coming up on Friday, September 30th, we'll have the first event of 6 events in a year-long series on Black countercartographies, which are exploring different literally dimensions of Black geographies, co-organized with my colleague Vanessa Agart-Jones. And so we kick off the series with geographers Daniel Purifoy of UNC Chapel Hill and Javon Scott Lewis of UC Berkeley. And also lastly, please mark your calendar for a memorial celebration of the life and work of our colleague, Professor Stephen Gregory. On November 18th, here at Columbia University at Faculty House, there'll be more information available. This gathering will also include an exhibition of Stephen's extraordinary photographs. So for more information about this and other events, please see our website, afamstudies.columbia.edu. So thank you to our audience for coming, for your insightful questions, for attending tonight's conversations. Please take care and be well.
Night, everybody.
Thank you.